you should treat this talk as me trying to, as an outsider, a total outsider, trying to tell you what you can learn from Bangladesh. Basically, what you can learn from your own recent history for what you need to do now. And that actually is important because we can't just think that there doesn't have to be a renewal and a new rethinking of where we are at the moment. So in the book that I wrote, Bangladesh comes out very well. I look across a whole series of countries in the world in recent times, which have made progress and which have not. And I talk largely about countries that come from low-income status, and very poor countries, and indeed Bangladesh features in it because it was my very first essay in development economics where I was told, can you discuss the title, Is Bangladesh a Basket Case? And I said, yes, absolutely, nothing will ever come from Bangladesh. So fortunately, that's some time ago, and I've learned, just as other people have often learned, that there are unlikely successes in development as well. And when you were historically an unlikely success, I wish you to be an unlikely succeeder in avoiding the middle income trap. And that's actually in the spirit that I want to talk. The essence, I think, of when we look, and I use political economy frameworks, and basically the simple way that I look at states across the world, and any state, whether you're a rich or poor state, fundamentally a state is somehow a coalition of influential and powerful people. And it's a very simple framework, and I mean by that, it's not just political leaders, it includes military leaders, it includes senior civil servants, it includes public intellectuals, it includes indeed many people in this room that basically consist of the elite players in a society that can shape. Sometimes the elite is broader, sometimes it's smaller, but they shape where a country is going and they play an important role. And as Abir suggested, it's not that I don't have people in there, but elites can either be the facilitators for progress or they can be the blockers. And that's basically how you would think of it. Every state, every functioning state, I look at it as an elite bargain for a minimal amount of peace and stability. Now, how the elite then uses a state can be in various ways. Why I actually am complimentary about Bangladesh is that historically, coming out of a very turbulent 1970s, there was an emergence there of an elite bargain that had one particular feature, that actually there was a broad understanding that delivering growth and also delivering to some extent development as well for a broader population was part of the state. Now we can argue forever where it came from, whether it was cultural, whether it came out of the conflict, whether it came out of enlightened leadership, whether it came out of anything else. It's still debated amongst academics where it came from, but you can definitely observe that there is something like this. Now, I call that a very specific development, elite bargain, and I call that a development bargain. And I think it's that feature in that period that emerged that you have in common with, say, South Korea in other periods in time, Vietnam, with China, or even to more unlikely places into Africa, Ghana, probably Ethiopia for a long period of time, and so on. And I think that's probably the single most common feature. How does development and growth take place? That there is an underlying shared commitment for growth and development across the elite there. And that's probably that you have in common with China. And I want to emphasize you have very little in common with China. That's probably one of the few things that you have. There's nothing you can learn from China in terms of state-led development, in terms of the way they went about it, the way they organized the state, and whatever, because China comes out of 2,000 years of centralized government, of basically a state that was doing centralized taxation, of a meritocratic bureaucracy, all kinds of features that made it, when in 1979 Deng Xiaoping and the reformers gambled on a path of reform and development, used the state for doing that, made sense, because there's probably no state in the world that had these features of historically. So that's an important thing. What you do need, in terms of the state, is a self-aware state that understands how much it can do and how much it can't do. And again, Bangladesh sensibly, in this key period, was sensible enough not to try to go for a totally state-led development path, but actually gave quite a lot of importance to macroeconomic stability and basic features, including befriending international institutions to actually keep the economy reasonably stable, to actually allow the private sector to emerge, yes, with close connections to the state, but enough so that the state didn't suffocate it and killed it off. And similarly, when the state was quite dysfunctional in terms of service delivery for poor people, it allowed NGOs to emerge that actually, and now you are the country with the largest NGOs in the world. And indeed, I would say there is no country in the world that wasn't self-aware enough to allow NGOs to become as big as in Bangladesh. India would not have allowed it, okay? That's an important thing that a lot of the equitable development, that you allowed it to take place by civil society and NGOs. And again, I compliment the state to be self-aware enough to leave that space. Now, that's maybe the 90s, the noughties. Where are we now? And actually moving to where we know next. Armin carefully explained very correctly what the challenges are and the needs, and everybody will emphasize diversification moving further. What the success was then by allowing the RMG sector, with quite a lot of luck, and you know better the history than I do, how it emerged, that it came about, but it was allowed to grow and being such an important part. Now, that's potentially your challenge. You have a very strong and effective, but actually undiversified export industry now. I think fundamentally finding new export engines is going to be crucially important, but that does mean you need to think more broader on what you do. There's other aspects as well, but what does it mean when I talk about upgrading? In the first instance, it's not about finding the technical part, and that's where I will, discuss further with Armin later on as well. It's not about the technical part of upgrading, it's also upgrading your elite bargain. It's to actually being willing to say, we'll need to be finding a new shared commitment. Now, who is usually the blocker of a new elite bargain? It's typically the elite itself. Because why is this? Because in any country in the world, the status quo is a very comfortable place to be in. Because that's how you then know how you can capture the rents and the profits from the position you have. That's how you can have the monopolies, the oligopolies in the economy, and so on. Basically, upgrading and changing the elite bargain will be disruptive. It needs courage of an elite to actually do this. It needs courage to actually questioning current positions of certain industries. It needs courage to actually being willing to do it. Because Gambling on Development, the title of my book, gambling on the next stage of development, is a risky thing for anyone who is playing in the elite, because it does change elite positions and so on. So what does it mean that you need and where you have to go for it? Well, the characteristics of a successful elite bargain for the next phase will involve credible politics for peace and stability. Let me not spend a lot of time on it, but I would argue, from what I know about the country and what people also tell me that are well informed about it, it's a challenge to actually, how do you move the politics of the credible politics across the whole elite and not a fraction of the elite to actually move that further. So the shared stability aspects of earlier periods, you need to find ways of renewing. You need to have the state that remains self-aware and doesn't think now suddenly, I can take credit of everything that happened, so therefore I can take charge of everything. Actually, the self-awareness of the state still needs to be there. You have to be careful not to think you can do China. You can't do Korea either. You are not a state like that. Your state is built on very different principles than the Korean state, so you want to be careful. So how self-aware of it? And that leads to me the final point around this, is that the key part of a successful development bargain is its ability to renew itself and to learn from its past mistakes, from its strengths and weaknesses. That needs forms of internal or external accountability. How do you learn it? I'm not going to dictate whether it's more external or internally needed. I'm sure there are people on the politics that would say it should be more external or less external. And I'm thinking here of political process, or it could be internal within the civil service, that you are keeping yourself very strictly to account. Can I say this? This is maybe a small thing you can learn from China, is the internal accountability in the delivery of development in the party is incredibly strong. And people get sacked and lose their jobs if they don't perform. So that's things that you need to think of it. So what does it mean? And I will finish now. So What you learn from Vietnam and Korea is actually not the technical part of the upgrading. It's actually the underlying commitment to keep on wanting to learn and to observe, and how do I need to go to the next part. What you also learn from Korea and Vietnam is, and from Malaysia, is at some point keeping that commitment that growth and development has to continue and doesn't run out of steam, and be content with the status quo where you are. So what does it mean? Three things. It probably means in the way you deal with the economy is to actually rethink very carefully, are the nature of the relationships between the private sector and the state and broader society, are they still fit for purpose? Is the nature of how you are connected? Look, in any state, connections between state and business exist. But is there enough scope there for renewal in who is actually leading in the business, what they are doing? An industrial policy that only is focused on picking winners, on protecting who is already there, on incumbency, is going to fail. It's definitely going to fail. So just as there was at some point the ability to emerge a totally new sector of RMG, there needs to be ability to emerge new sectors as well. That has real importance for your industrial policy. Dare I say, I think, and that's my view in that thing, industrial policy, you need to change your attitude to FDI. You need to change. Most of these countries, Vietnam and Korea, found a way of handling it. You want to find your own way. But we've learned over the last 30, 40 years, there are terrible ways of handling FDI and there are good ways of handling FDI. That is almost, I would say, a slight embarrassment on the economic record of this country, that actually FDI finds it's very hard to come. You have a strong enough industrial sector to actually learn to handle it and deal with it. You need to be much more open on that, because that's one way of renewing your position in global tradable markets. The second thing, and I'll really finish there, is to actually a renewal of what it meant at the time to be self-aware of a state, to step back in the things where you need to step back and not step back in the things you need to be there. So you actually have to rethink this. You can't be content with the way you've done your supporting of business and working with it, and how accountability is working in the whole system. And then finally, I think you need to find a way of learning how to upgrade your state. The state is not the Korean state. You're very far of it. That's why I keep on emphasizing the self-aware state. Your state is built up on other principles. It includes what political scientists will call clientelism. People get positions because of connections and rewarding things, not necessarily a pure meritocracy. But you need to think very carefully where you begin to upgrade your state. I would say probably in three areas that actually begin to hinder the economy as much. I am not obsessed in itself with corruption, but, there's a but, I don't condone it, but there are places where these things are really hindering your economic progress. I would say procurement fraud is still too widespread. In an infrastructure-led progress, it's really something to work on. Land corruption and land grabbing is still a huge issue, and finally on customs and so on. These are key areas. You focus on these in upgrading your state to become more transparent, to be more functional, because you can't go to that next stage without dealing this. So in sum, renew the elite bargain. That's part of essentially of upgrading your economy as well. Thank you.